Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder organization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and I hope you're here to stay. If you've been here before, thank you so much for your support. Before starting on today's video, I just need to give a big thank you to all of you. We have hit 800 subscribers since I launched this channel about a month ago now, and I was honestly not expecting to be hitting this number this quickly. I really appreciate it, and I hope I can keep pumping out quality content for all of you, and I hope all of you enjoy this content more and more. Aim for 1,000 subscribers by the middle of November. Let's see. On to the video. Well, today I'm here with the piping hot take that range combat is incredibly powerful. I know, incredible take. But no, seriously, I think people underestimate how good range combat can be in this game. Range combat doesn't have the flashiness of melee combat, and thus it often gets ignored. I've had so many arguments with folks over on Reddit where someone or the other says it is dishonest to use range combat as a comparison for anything, say, related to caster damage, because range martials suck anyways, and that blows my mind. I have seen so many range martials in action, and range martials are really powerful. They're not better than melee martials necessarily, nor are melee martials better than them. They just have their own upsides and downsides. To reiterate what I said in a previous video, for which the card you'll see up there, melee have the upside of potency and reliability. Ranged have the upside of efficiency, sustainability, and versatility. If you don't know what I mean exactly with these terms, I recommend going back to the video where I established those fundamental 5 axes for comparing things, because I'm going to be using them again and again. So what is it that makes melee more potent, more reliable, and what is it that makes range better at these other 3? What are the practical upsides of all of these in any combat, any difficult encounter that you would see in a typical Pathfinder adventuring day? Let's find out. So to explain why melee is bad, first we have to talk about how melee is incredible. And no, seriously, this will make sense, I promise. Why do we go into melee? It's not just to look cool and wield big weapons, right? Well, it's mostly that, but no, there's real upsides to being in melee. The most obvious of them, of course, is if you just get to stand and make strikes turn after turn, round after round, action after action, you do more damage than a ranged weapon. Your base weapon damage die is bigger, you get to add strength to your damage. When you get striking runes, your damage dice increase their gap relative to ranged weapons, and you get access to unique class features and multiple action activities that increase your damage in ways that ranged characters may not get access to. On top of all that, you're often benefiting from flanking, which means not only is your damage more potent as a 7.1, it's actually more reliable too, because your enemy's armor class is often just lower than it appears to be. On top of all this, you have very strong reactions. Reactive strike is the most obvious one, but melee characters generally benefit from having disproportionately good reactions. Champion's reaction, for example, is only available when you're standing fairly close to the melee. And of course, you have access to athletics maneuvers. Shove, grapple, trip, disarm, reposition. All of these are varying levels of good depending on your party, the specific encounter, the terrain you're fighting in, and as long as you have a free hand or a weapon with the appropriate trait, you get access to these incredibly powerful maneuvers. But Mathfinder, these are all upsides. I thought you were talking about how melee is worse than ranged in many cases. So what's going on? The single biggest downside of melee is that all of your melee enemies will also have the same upsides that you do. You get to deal good damage, so do your enemies. They also have larger damage than their ranged allies, and they also have the benefit of constantly flanking you. You have cool abilities that are 2 actions or 3 actions that do extra damage, so do all of your enemies. Thugs, for example, have a 2-action ability that says, every creature that is within reach takes 1 strike from me without any multiple attack penalty. Dragons have the Draconic Frenzy ability, which lets them make 3 attacks for the cost of 2 actions. So plenty of monsters have their own form of map reduction or action compression that matches the kinds of abilities you get. On top of all this, monsters have other cool abilities that interact with you that do more than damage or just worsen the amount of damage you take. A Shuln can just destroy your armor when it crits you. A Scorpion can poison you, and ongoingly it'll weaken you, while the Scorpion is also threatening you with its own attacks the whole time. You have good reactions, so do plenty of monsters. Reactive Strike itself may be somewhat rare. Maybe I think 10 or so % of monsters have it. Don't quote me on that. I think that's the figure. But plenty of monsters have really cool and really powerful reactions. A Wood Golem, for example, can hit you when you hit it. A Kauthooge, for example, can take your strike, use its reaction to deflect your strike onto your friend, and then as part of the same reaction move away from you, while also getting to ignore your reactions. That's a lot of value just compressed onto one single reaction. And as you get to higher levels, these reactions get more and more common. You have good athletics maneuvers, monsters laugh at the quality of your athletic maneuvers. The grab and the knockdown traits are the two biggest contenders for this, because what those traits do is after a strike, a monster can use one action to completely ignore the multiple attack penalty, both any previous penalty as well as without causing any future penalty, either grapple you or trip you. And because they're ignoring multiple attack penalty, there's a high chance that your grapple might restrain you. And if this is an improved grab or an improved knockdown, they can do this as a free action rather than as a regular action. So monsters even have that benefit over you. And being ranged simply mitigates a lot of these problems. A ranged character doesn't have to worry about flanking as much. They have a bit more agency over this. They don't have to worry about 2 to 3 action abilities as much, because if the enemy's spending actions getting into range, they have fewer actions for those abilities. It's easier to play around such reactions with your own positioning. It's also easier to ignore the grab and the knockdown and other similar traits, because a monster would have to spend more actions getting to you, and thus it'll be a little less dangerous even if you do get grabbed. For example, if a monster strides up to you, strikes you, and then restrains you, that's 3 actions. It might just be done its turn. Whereas if you were already standing next to it, it might strike you, restrain you, and then have a 3rd action to, say, choke you while you're restrained, right? This is where the sustainability and efficiency problems of melee come up. All of your enemies have all of melee's upsides. That means you take a lot of damage. That means you lose a lot of your actions to maneuvers and or other sorts of controlling and debuffing effects. That means your party has to spend more time rescuing you from such situations or healing you if you're very low on health. And all of these contribute to the fact that melee have much less action efficiency and impact their party's sustainability. Now, of course, all of these downsides can be mitigated with tactical play. If you suspect an enemy may grab you, move away. Deny them those actions even as a melee character, right? The problem here is, that is something the monsters can also inflict on you. If you are more dangerous in melee than the enemies you're fighting, intelligent enemies will just try to stay away from you, cost you actions as you try to catch up to them. Conversely, if they happen to be more dangerous in melee than you should be the one trying to stay away. Just like I mentioned in the previous slide, if the enemy can restrain you very reliably, you have to try and stay away from them. You can't keep getting rescued by your ally casting Acid Grip in the back. If you do this, you might be endangering your allies to an even worse fate. Maybe it's not that bad if you get restrained. Maybe it's a bit more of a disaster if the wizard gets restrained, right? They might ignore you and try to go for the backliners, so you may not even have a choice. Regardless of how you look at it, intelligent enemies can make melee really dangerous, really cumbersome, and really inefficient. Of course, if you're fighting completely mindless enemies or just simple enemies who wouldn't have a good understanding of tactics, this doesn't apply. But in general, monsters will have the agency to try and make melee miserable. And of course, that's not to say there are no countermeasures to this. Reactions can help you protect your backliners while also enabling you to stay a little bit further away from the melee if you need to. And conversely, a lot of melee characters have ways to catch up to enemies, use backup weapons, use certain runes, use options other than making strikes to impact the battlefield even if the enemy is able to stay away from you. All of these are downsides of melee, but they're not impossible to overcome downsides. Pathfinder doesn't really impose downsides on you that are just like, oh, you're out of combat. You will just have to struggle through it. You may need backup options, and I'll get into that at the end of this video. That brings us to the third major downside of being in melee, Melee characters get fewer tactical choices throughout a combat. The previous two slides that I presented kind of get lumped in together as just being a first turn downside. Lots of people often dismiss the downsides of melee as being, oh, it just means on turn 1 you have to stride once and then you're fine. There's no more downsides of melee. And that is not even remotely true. But that downside does exist and it kind of fits into this. The first turn downside basically means that you might have to stride plus strike, or you might go stride and make 2 strikes. But a ranged martial will just have fewer of those problems. They might just use all 3 actions on striking, use a demoralize somewhere in there. They just have that third action to play with much more easily. That downside can also extend past turn 1. As I said in the previous slide, an intelligent enemy should be trying to turn that against you if you're stronger in melee, and you should be using your actions defensively if you're weaker than them in melee. And either way, that means your action economy is not all that clean. It is worth noting that some specific range versus melee comparisons aren't going to be so cut and dry. For example, a ranged magus actually has an uglier action economy than, say, a melee fighter might. That is a specific exception, though. By and large, ranged characters will have cleaner action economies. They will often get to stand back, use demoralize, use recall knowledge. Hell, they may get to use actions that are not just one of these basic actions either. For example, when I talk about the fighter, they have a feat called exacting strike, which lets them preserve a lowered multiple attack penalty for 1 additional action. A ranged fighter can easily stand back and make 3 strikes and benefit off of that, whereas a melee martial might never get an opportunity to do so in a difficult combat. Ranged martials will typically have a cleaner action economy, especially in the very first turn of combat, but it goes beyond that, as I said on the previous slide. It goes even further beyond that, however, because tactical flexibility isn't just a simple case of how many actions do I have. It goes into other cases too. For example, target priority is a severely underestimated aspect of being in melee versus standing at range. Let's say your group comes across 4 enemies. 2 of them are standing further behind, that are 2 strides away from you, and 2 of them are standing closer by. Your wizard goes first and fireballs all of them. Now let's say one of the ones in the back critically fails their saving throw. If you're a melee martial, you need to take 2 strides to get to them, and then your single strike action might not kill that character. Meanwhile, a ranged martial can just fire 3 times at the one that crit failed, try to get them down this turn. This immediately translates to the opposing side losing a whole character, losing 3 whole actions right away on turn 1 and never gaining those back. That kind of target priority is not something melee characters have the full privilege of. The terrain can also be a limitation that causes this problem. For example, if you're fighting within a choke point of some kind, the enemy's melees might occupy the choke point, and then behind them is the spellcaster, who now just gets to wreak havoc against your party. A ranged character on your side can target that spellcaster, but you are forced to attack these melee enemies who presumably are a lot harder to hit than that spellcaster. This also means you have to suffer from reactions, auras, other positional downsides, difficult terrain, etc. that enemies can inflict on you. This kind of goes into the previous 2 slides, but it's still worth noting. You will have fewer options to rescue yourself from these. You will probably need to rely on others to help you to get through these. You may just not be able to do anything about them. Situations like this pop up for melee martials all the time. You're often going to be attacking the least bad target because of all of these limitations, whereas range martials don't have that limitation. Now, of course, that doesn't mean range martials are immune to such a downside. A ranged character might also find themselves suffering from enemy reactions in, say, a cramped space. It's just that, in my experience, ranged characters need the GM to be specifically trying to counter them for these limitations to pop up too frequently, whereas for melee, this kind of just pops up naturally. When you fight enemies in a typical battlefield, you will often just face these downsides of melee characters unless you're playing in Abomination Vault specifically, I guess, where everything is cramped. And even then, smart enemies can turn the cramped spaces against you. Naturally, this leads to the next big problem of being in melee. Your very existence negates your allies' tactical choices and options too. This often gets completely ignored in optimization advice that's provided online because optimization advice is so often selfish. It's focused on your DPR or your uptime or maximizing your crowd control. It's never given from the perspective of, oh, my allies' actions matter too, but they do. Here's a few examples of how just by being in melee, you might limit your allies' tactical options. If you're standing in melee and let's say you're a little deeper into the enemy formation, instead of hitting 4 enemies with the fireball, the wizard might hit 3 enemies or even just 2 enemies. And if you've looked at how AoE scales with the number of enemies, hitting 2 or 3 enemies instead of 4 is a sizable disadvantage to how well this fireball would perform. You're reducing your allies' tactical flexibility. You're reducing the amount of damage they do. This applies doubly so for control spells. Fireball is just a one-shot damage spell. You can stay out of its way, right? But what if it's a rust cloud? What if it's an entangling flora? What if it's a wall of stone? Your placement and the people you want to target in combat warp the way your allies can help you and help win the combat. Then there's a consideration that you might be forcing your healer to stand a lot closer to the battlefield than they like to. This is something I've seen pop up again and again in a game I'm playing right now. We start at level 1, we're level 2 right now. The barbarian runs into melee. That means the cleric is now forced to stay 30 feet away from the barbarian at all times, ready to cast heal, ready to use delay consequence. This means that now the cleric, wearing their lightly armored robes, is in even more danger than they otherwise would be. If we were a more ranged heavy party, the cleric would have the flexibility to move back whenever needed because we can move back with them. That flexibility is gone when we have one melee party member. Even if everyone else can stay out of that 30-foot range, the healer is forced to stay right there with the melee character, and that's dangerous. And all the downsides that you inflict on yourself from being in melee, you're inflicting a softer version of those on your healer, who's now standing at the mid-range position of battlefield. Finally, you might minimize the impact of your ally's action denial. For example, let's say the monk walks up to the enemy, picks them up, uses Whirling Throw to throw them away. Then you run up to that enemy and strike them. Now you have completely negated the action denial that your friend inflicted on them. Sure, they inflicted a bit of damage too, but the big thing about Whirling Throw is how far you throw the enemy. They have to walk back up to you. They have to waste actions. They might trigger your party's reactions. All of that got negated because you just ran into combat. It's not like you made a bad decision by running into combat. It's just your character kind of needed to do that, right? You couldn't just stand back and wait for the enemy all the time. Maybe you could delay. The point is, either you have to limit your own options or you're going to limit your allies' options anytime something like this happens. A little bit of tension there where trying to perform at your maximum might mean you're negating the impact your ally has in the battlefield. And of course, it is really worth noting, ranged characters might sometimes have worse flexibility than melee characters. Like I said in the previous slide, this only happens in my experience when a scenario is specifically conjured up to counter ranged characters. Whereas for melee characters, this just kind of pops up naturally because of how strong enemies tend to be in melee themselves. The next big upside is that ranged characters have their own little bucket of options that melee characters kind of don't have access to. This often gets understated. I've seen a lot of people say melee characters have the advantage in versatility because of things like athletics maneuvers, but it's kind of the opposite. I feel like athletics maneuvers are so powerful primarily because they're melee characters' only way of doing things that are not strike. Likewise for their insanely good reactions. I find that ranged characters can just inherently use items and character options other than strikes better. I kind of got into this on a previous slide when I was talking about how ranged characters can use Demoralize and Recall Knowledge and feats better than melee characters can because of their action flexibility. However, when we talk specifically about items, there's the fact that ranged characters often have an easier draw-stow economy. When you don't have to spend actions striding up to the enemy, striding away from the enemy, etc., you just have that one extra action that you sometimes need to swap to a different weapon, or swap to an item, or draw an item. More importantly, your manipulate trait does not trigger reactions unless the enemy has already closed the gap with you, in which case you're in a little bit of trouble, but melee characters are almost always in that level of trouble, whereas you're only sometimes in that level of trouble. Special shout out to bows over here, because their 1+ hand trait means that you can hold them in one hand, draw something, do something with that item, and not need to change your grip to continue attacking with them, because they count as 1+ hand rather than 2. It goes beyond that though. It's not just that it's easy for you to draw or stow. Being in the back means you just have more decisions to make on this. You can throw bombs at enemies, you can cast a cantrip that you gain from an item or from a spellcasting dedication. You can use specialty ammunition, which melee, as far as I know, don't really have an equivalent of. Melees have talismans, but I think specialty ammunition tends to be a lot more varied and powerful and can just achieve a lot of things that often cover for the downsides of being at range. For example, we keep emphasizing how melee characters have the big downside of being able to trip enemies. A ranged character can use a bola shot and achieve the exact same thing. And then there's the fact that you benefit more from the strongest of the property runes. For example, the rooting rune. This rune, when you crit, just immobilizes an enemy. They have to use an action to get away, and even if they succeed, they've still wasted a whole action. If you're in melee, it's just less likely that they'll be able to waste this action. If you combine this with other things, like say the critical specialization effect of a bow, you may end up with a creature just not really having much of a turn because you crit on them once. And these downsides are much harder to inflict when you're in melee range. Of course, you could try mixing these kinds of things up with movement and athletics maneuvers, but again, that means you're impacting your efficiency to catch up with the natural versatility of a ranged character. Melee characters already have somewhat poor efficiency. They have to reduce it even further to reduce some of their other downsides. There's also deployable items like caltrops, deployable cover, and other such things that ranged characters can just make better use of. This also kind of leans into point 4, where if your party has a ranged lean, your whole party can benefit from this, whereas even one melee character can make this harder to deal with. And lastly, and most importantly, Pathfinder optimization is at its best when you work with your party. This is kind of the spiritual inverse of an earlier point where I said the enemies can be intelligent and turn all of the downsides of melee against you, and likewise, they're often benefiting from the upsides of melee. The inverse of that is that if your party knows what to do, you can turn all the downsides of melee on them, and they can't really do much because players tend to have more options than monsters in this game. Turn all of the disadvantage we talked about onto the enemies who are locked into melee. This makes you much more likely to succeed at combat. Does it make you invincible? Of course not. For example, let's say a party that looks something like Warrior Bard, Stone Order Druid, Precision Ranger with a crossbow, and a Flurry of Maneuvers Monk. The Monk, as a melee character, has a responsibility of running in, making sure enemies are tripped, shoved, grabbed, whatever it takes to keep the ranged members of the party safe, and then running out if need be. The Druid applies AoE damage and control. The Bard applies sustained damage and uses Courageous Advance to help people reposition around. And the Precision Ranger applies some spike damage. And the end result of all of this, your party can very efficiently, tactically take out enemies while denying them all of the upsides of melee, while benefiting from the fact that they're suffering the downsides of melee. You can add up to a lot more than the sum of your parts and kind of just win a lot of combats. Again, this won't make you invincible. You might get caught off guard by an ambush. You might get caught off guard in a cramped space. Sometimes the combat might start from a diplomatic situation rather than you just busting down a door and attacking enemies. You're not invincible, but it is a very good strategy. Melee has inherent disadvantages. That doesn't make it bad. It's just it's very well known what it takes to make melee better, whereas it is a little harder to make range the optimized way of performing. So what's the takeaway from all this? Is melee just bad in Pathfinder? Of course not. That's not the case. Melee has potency and reliability advantages to make up for all this. That's why they get to do so much damage. That is why their damage is so reliable. And then range has the efficiency, sustainability, and versatility advantages. Range can also feel hard countered by crammed spaces and enemies with a ton of reactions. that doesn't mean range is bad, right? And similarly, the fact that melee gets hard countered, often more so than range does, doesn't mean melee is bad. It just means your party will have to coordinate with you and account for one another's weaknesses and strengths. If your party has a heavy lean towards melee, that means maybe somebody needs to take the role of a healer, and if no one person wants to do it, maybe multiple people do. Maybe the controllers need to make sure they're picking spells that work well with melee, or even work exceptionally well with melee. For example, there are certain spells that work really well when a melee character can shove enemies back into them. Conversely, if you have a ranged heavy lean, you would play differently. Maybe you lean harder into battlefield control effects to split the battlefield, make it easier to take on enemies piecemeal, make it harder for enemies to come up to you for engagement. You would consider backup options for when you find yourself in a cramped space. Whenever you look at the 5 fundamental axes, you ask yourself 2 questions. Am I choosing to emphasize my strengths while somebody else covers my weaknesses because my weaknesses are major? Or am I going to cover my weaknesses with backup options? For a melee character, this means look to your allies for healing, look to your allies for defensive buffs, look to your allies for control effects. Or it means carry backup javelins, carry a bow, pick up a cantrip from a spellcasting dedication or something along the sort, so that you have options in cases where melee is not working out well. And similarly, for a ranged character, this means you may have to rely on allies to help you not get caught in a melee, or you would have to come up with a backup plan for when you do get caught in a melee. And of course, you would have to inform your allies not to just waste the tactical flexibility you earned them by being a ranged martial. That'll be all for today's video, folks. This has been a bit of a different video than a lot of my previous ones. I'm not looking at anything specific. I'm more just musing on the upsides and downsides of things in general, kind of like the end of my fundamental axes of optimization video. If you like this sort of content, let me know and you'll see more of it in the future. If you don't, I apologize. This is at least partly because I'm going to be traveling soon and I had to get something out in a little bit more of a rush than usual. I hope you still found this helpful, and I hope I may have changed some minds on ranged characters in Pathfinder, because I find them quite underrated overall, and I do think they have a lot of tangible, real upsides. That's all for today, folks. I've been Mathfinder. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you like more of this content, or if you dislike it and want to let me know. Until next time.